So we are back in our What is Truth again, talking about point number 6. That truth doesn't equal science and science doesn't equal truth. Last week, we discussed the facts about the fossils of the so-called missing links and the so-called cavemen. And this week we're going to continue talking about fossils, but we're going to move on to talking about dinosaurs and other living fossils. Because you can't really have a discussion about fossils without having a discussion about dinosaurs. Charlie had them, Jonah. Oh, they're over. We're good. We're good. And here's the critical question about dinosaurs. Did dinosaurs really live millions of years ago and then they all went extinct? Because that's the belief that every one of us has been indoctrinated with. What I'm going to share with you and submit to you today is that the answer to that question is a whopping no. They didn't live millions of years ago. Plus, not only am I sure, I'm going to shake things up a bit with what we've been indoctrinated with, and I'm going to provide evidence that not only did they not live millions of years ago, but they've existed right alongside man ever since his creation. I'm going to provide even more shocking evidence to you that dinosaurs still exist today, living right alongside modern man. And if that's the case, that also means dinosaurs must have been on the ark that Noah built. So, for most of you, I would venture to say that those statements shock you. See? See how shocked she is? It shocks you because what we've done in our society is elevate dinosaurs to a mythical, almost godlike status. Dinosaurs are actually revered by our society, and they've been put in like this special category all their own. Entire theories have been created about dinosaur, and not good ones. For example, the gap theory, which I told you I'm going to talk about in a couple weeks, was basically created to accommodate the dinosaurs and all the other so-called animals that you would refer to as prehistoric forms of life. So, since we've all been taught that dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago, that means there must be an enormous amount of time missing from the creation story in the book of Genesis. And that's what the gap theory was created in order to try to account for. So like I said, we're going to address that in a few weeks. But what I'm here to tell you is, don't believe all the hype about the dinosaurs. Other than their size, they're really not that special. As cool as they are, and I too think they're cool, they're nothing more than big animals. Really, really big animals in some cases, right? But still, nothing more than big animals. They were just large reptile or reptilian-like animals who put their big reptilian-like pants on one leg at a time, just like we do. So, if my statements about dinosaurs living right alongside modern man shock you, I have some advice for you. Just get over it. Get over it. And just pay attention to the data that I'm going to share with you today and tomorrow, or today and next week. Okay, and first of all, let's talk about the size. Dinosaurs are not the only big animals that have ever lived. For example, the blue whale, which is alive today, is the largest animal that has ever lived on this planet. But not only that, the fossil records include grasshoppers that are 2 feet long, 18-inch cockroaches. Try having those in your kitchen, huh? Sharks, megalodon, 80 feet long. Dragonflies with wingspans that are 3 feet. Centipedes that are 8 feet long. Bat-like animals that have wingspans of 15 feet. Turtles that are 12 foot long. And on and on and on. So, dinosaurs lived among animals that would be considered giants by today's standards, indicating that at one time, a majority of the creatures roaming the earth were much bigger than they are today. But then something happened, and everything changed. And what that something is can be summed up as a worldwide flood. You see, in order to address dinosaurs and other prehistoric, as they call them, forms of life, you also have to address a few other topics that go right alongside of it. Those topics being things like time itself, the flood, and some aspects of geology. All these aspects come into play together here. So you have to address all of them. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do this right and address all those things. So, as I was saying, everything changed with the worldwide flood. So, prior to the flood, the earth was very different than it is now. Two very important ways the earth would have been different in the pre-flood days are the amount of UV radiation in our atmosphere and the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. Prior to the flood, UV radiation would have been much lower. Oxygen levels would have been much higher. Two big differences: much less UV radiation and much more oxygen. Evidence exists that the earth was once covered by a thick canopy of water. This would have created a greenhouse effect, giving the earth a terrarium-like climate where uniform warm temperatures would have covered the entire earth. The entire earth would have been like a lush tropical rainforest. And the existence of such a canopy has been argued by others such as Isaac Newton Vail and Donald Sear. They have a lot of data on this. But more importantly than that, the existence of a water canopy is fully supported by Genesis 1:6-8, which says this: "And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. The sky separated the waters below it on the earth from the waters above it in the atmosphere, the canopy of water layer that was above it. Such a canopy, yeah?
So at that time, it was like everywhere, like just sticky and humid 24/7, pretty much.
So he goes right to the negative side, that it was going to be stinking humid all the time, right?
Water in the air.
Above, not where, this is not in reference to water in the atmosphere like we measure humidity. This is an entire canopy of water in the atmosphere above the sky, what the limits of what the atmosphere that we see as the sky, above that. So this is different than humidity than we would have felt in the atmosphere. Okay? It's almost like a bubble of water around our atmosphere that stayed up in the atmosphere. Okay? All right? All right. So, such a canopy would have not only created a warm global climate, it would have greatly limited the amount of UV radiation coming in. Limited UV would have resulted in increased longevity. Increased longevity would have contributed to an increase in size. A lush tropical climate would have also increased the amount of oxygen levels. Not surprisingly, the analysis of pre-flood insects and other plants and animals that get encased in amber, when they analyze those, they find the air contains 32% oxygen, as opposed to our current levels, which are only 21%. Other studies have showed that the oxygen level was as high as 35%. Either way, this shows at least 50% more oxygen in the atmosphere back then than we have today. So to sum all this up, more oxygen, less UV radiation. Plants and animals lived longer and grew bigger. Right there. They lived longer and grew bigger. This accounts for the large size of the dinosaurs and so many of the other animals, like the examples that I already gave you of. Also makes you wonder how big Noah and his family were and all the other people who lived before the flood, right? And the increased longevity is certainly recorded in the Bible, right? Okay. But the worldwide flood destroyed the water canopy above the earth. Longevity and size decreased, with giants now becoming the exception as opposed to the norm like they used to be. And please remember this. The time of the flood, it was not just a flood. We learned from chapters 6 through 9 of the book of Genesis. There was also worldwide earthquakes, worldwide volcanic eruptions, and a worldwide release of waters from the deep. So there were waters under the land, not just sitting on it. Additional water from below the ground that was released. All of this combined to produce an unparalleled amount of force and devastation upon the earth. And all the volcanic activity would have sent huge black clouds of ash and sulfur gas out into our atmosphere. And that would have caused the water canopy to drop out. All that water would have come down as torrential rains, lasting 40 days and 40 nights. Exactly what the Bible says. All this together, the earthquakes, the volcanoes, the flooding, the release of the waters from the deep, would have caused a global, unparalleled, cataclysmic event. And in this brief summary that I just went through, we find the diametric difference between the evolutionists and those who would call themselves creationists. And here it is. The evolutionists believe that all the features of the earth that we see today happen slowly, gradually, over huge amounts of time. And that belief is called uniformitarianism. I'll give you a second on that one, because that word's a mouthful. That's called Uniformitarianism. Just like it sounds. Uniformitarianism. As opposed to the creationists, believe that the features of the earth that we have today formed rapidly as a result of a massive catastrophic global event. God bless you. And that's called catastrophism. Something catastrophic caused it all to happen. Catastrophism. So here we have two competing agendas. But the question is, what do the data tell us? So guess what we're going to do? We're going to look at some data. And I'm going to start by doing this. We're going to talk about the reference of time. And I'm going to go through a few processes that the evolutionists tell us take millions and millions of years to happen. And I'm going to show you what the data actually say. The first one we're going to look at, petrification. The bottom line here for this is that petrification doesn't take anywhere near as long as the evolutionists say it does. So how long does it take wood and other things to petrify? In the book called How Long Does It Take for Wood to Petrify? Dr. John Morris informs us that no informed geologist would say it takes an excessively long time, certainly less time than it takes for wood to decay in a given environment. As Dr. Morris explains, did I go two? Yeah. No. This is it, right? No? Yeah, see, I told you I was wrong. As he explains, wood can petrify rapidly anytime conditions exist where it can decompose in water enriched with silica. Silica is an element usually found in the compound called silicon dioxide, which is what we call quartz. Okay? Anytime you have a lot of that, and guess what? There's a lot of that present in volcanic ash. In fact, it's been done in laboratories. They've petrified wood. As Popular Science reported in 1992, a recipe exists for petrifying wood. The truth is that Hamilton Hicks of Greenwich, Connecticut, was awarded a patent for the recipe for petrified wood in 1986. Wow. Furthermore, wood has also been petrified rapidly in field settings that mirror conditions of water enriched with silica. Researchers dangled a block of wood down inside an alkaline spring in Yellowstone Park to test the effects of the hot silica environment on the wood. They discovered substantial petrification occurred in only 1 year. Take a look at this. This chunk of wood, 2 chunks actually, sits outside the National History Museum in Washington, D.C. It has a sign on it that says, this wood is over 200 million years old. Don't believe it, right? Let's move on to, summary statement. It doesn't take a long time for wood to petrify. It just takes the proper conditions. Okay? Let's go on to the next one. Because it's not just wood that can turn to stone quicker than the evolutionists tell us. Stucky, the petrified dog, is on exhibit in the Southern Forest World Museum in Waycross, Georgia. The dog apparently chased an animal into a hollow tree, got stuck, hence Stucky, couldn't get himself back out of the hollow tree, and died inside the hollow tree. But here's the thing. The dog inside the hollow tree petrified. He turned to a fossil faster than he could decompose. Then there's the limestone cowboy. This exhibit of a fossilized human leg below the knee inside a cowboy boot is on display at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The rubber-soled boot is estimated to be manufactured in the 1950s. Is not petrified yet, but the leg inside it is. This was found in 1980 in a town in West Texas. Again, faster than the boot itself could petrify. Okay, there we go. A New Zealand town was buried in 1886 under an enormous volcanic eruption. They've dug all kinds of interesting things up from there. For example, a bowler's hat, petrified. They've also dug up ham that's petrified, bags of flour that have petrified. That was in 1886, folks. But there's also examples of fossilized pickles, acorns, chopped firewood, etc. Again, petrifying much, much faster than the evolutionists say it takes. How about diamonds? Yes?
So if you were to have to meet those regulations or whatever, it's impossible to like resist the petrification by like, I guess.
You have to be dead.
Yes.
Oh, you have to be dead?
Yeah. Yeah, you need, if it's an animal, it needs to be deceased. If it's like a block of wood or like we're talking about there, chopped firewood, for example, it just has to remain in the proper conditions for an extended period of time. But the point there, again, that extended period of time isn't anywhere near what the evolutionists say it is. How about diamonds? They can be manufactured in the lab in weeks. Two processes that have been around since the 1950s. Involves high pressure and high temperatures. Small diamonds were found in a meteorite crater here in Arizona in the 50s. They realized the diamonds were formed on impact of the meteorite. High pressure, high heat. Again, it's the proper conditions, not time, that creates diamonds. Oil, another one's worth mentioning. Oil is created from dead animals under extreme heat and pressure. The evolutionists tell us that the oil deposit we have in our ground have been there for millions and millions of years. But guess what? Oil is created today rapidly from organic waste using high pressure thermal treatment. Takes about 30 minutes. Plants now exist in places like Texas and Australia where they convert organic waste and sewage into oil. Waste vegetable oils they also use to do the same thing, to turn into biodiesel fuels in about the same amount of time. Again, it's the proper conditions, not time, that's necessary. And speaking of oil, it's worth noting all the oil deposits that we find are under great pressure, usually in the range of 20 to 30,000 psi, which is greater than the weight of the rocks on top of it. If it wasn't so, when they hit a new deposit, the oil wouldn't spew forth for days and weeks at times till they can get a cap on it, right? It's because of that pressure. But oil also seeps out of its confinement naturally. So if oil had been around for millions and millions of years and it can seep out naturally, would we not find some deposits that were no longer under that grade of pressure? But we have never found a single one yet. And that can only happen if it was formed much more recently. From oil, we can go to coal, which forms from dead plants. Another substrate that doesn't take millions of years to form. One case in point. Its precursor, which is called peat, in the bottom of Spirit Lake, which was next to Mount St. Helens during the massive 1980 eruption, ripped down tens of thousands of trees and dumped them all into the bottom of that lake. Only about 10, 15 years after that, when they were down looking at those trees, they're already forming peat, which means they're already on their way to forming coals in just like a decade or two. But this is even more interesting. Coal deposits, mining coal, they have found things inside the coal, like this: an iron pot, a thimble, spears, a human skull, a bell, an 8-carat gold chain, a measuring tape, nails, screws, coins, gear mechanisms, a spark plug, etc., etc., etc. What that means is coal has obviously been around in the same time frame that man has been around. Once again, it's the proper conditions, not time, that creates coal. Then let's talk about flowstone formations, things like stalactites and stalagmites. Another one that evolutionists say take millions of years to develop. If you ever go into any of the caves in the national parks, they say, don't touch it. It takes millions of years. Yeah, listen to this. There's numerous examples that show this is not the case. Stalactites, over 5 feet long, were found in the basement under the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1960. This photo here is taken in 1960 when they found them. Folks, the memorial was built in 1923, showing that these things grew 5 feet in only 37 years, not millions of years. The same thing under the George Rogers Clark Memorial in Vincennes, Indiana. Only 40 years after it was built, they have found flowstone columns 11 feet tall in 40 years. That photo right there is from 1976, 40 years after it was built. And check out those socks. How about that, huh? 11 feet in 40 years. Go, boy. There we go. 1953. A photo was taken of a bat in Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico, that had fallen onto a stalagmite and was preserved inside of it faster than it could decompose. And here is another photo of the same bat that was originally taken in 1953. That flowstone covered him faster than the bat could decompose. This one is awesome. The TP Fountain, Hot Springs State Park, Thermopolis, Wyoming. This is an enormous flowstone deposit. This began in 1903 when a pipe was driven into the ground to allow mineral-rich water to escape. Calcium carbonate was released and started building up on the pipe, okay? Today, that's how big it is. It's the size of a 2-story house. In a little over 100 years, that's how big it got right there. That's why they call it the Teepee Fountain, because it looks like it's the size of a 2-story house now. Again, time is not the major factor in these things developing. It's the proper conditions. So we can also talk about ice rings, yes? I think they just say, it just talks about they named it Teepee Fountain and to stay off. I don't think it has anything related to like what we're talking about.
It's really weird that they would even use something like that because it's just saying that they're wrong.
Well, yeah, but it's a huge tourist draw now.
Yeah.
So how they explain that is a great point, because they would not be able to explain it from the evolutionist point of view. So let's talk about ice rings. The story of the lost squadron from World War II. There were 6 P-38 Lightnings and 2 B-17s flying from here to England. They got into some bad weather and were forced to make an emergency landing on the ice in Greenland. The men were rescued, but their planes had to be left behind. Well, in 1990, there was an expedition that went back there to recover one of the P-38 Lightning airplanes. And they had to cold mine down through 250 feet of ice rings to get down to the plane. And here's a picture of the plane under the ice that they got down to, while it's still there before they got it out. Using the evolutionist timescale, they would say that this 250 feet of ice rings represents 3,400 years, the way they count them. But we know the planes were only there 48 years, okay? So the rings don't represent seasons like the evolutionists say they do. They simply represent periods of differing temperature and differing snow and ice conditions that cause different degrees of clarity and opaqueness in the ice, which appears as a ring. And oh, by the way, here's a picture of the P-38 Lightning they recovered, flying again. They named it Glacier Girl. I think that's a pretty appropriate name. So that guy that got that still flies that guy around, takes it to air shows. Yes.
So, wait, how do ice rings form? I've never seen them.
It all has to do with varying temperatures and different types of snow.
How come it's different types of snow?
Let's pick this up later, okay? But snow is not always the same condition. There's different types of snow. In fact, the Eskimos have like 60 different words for snow because they represent that many different types of snow. I don't know if it's 60, but it's several, like 30 or 40, but I think it was 60, a lot of different names for snow. All right. Here's the bottom line for all this, the critical point we learned. All these processes, petrification, fossilization, diamond creation, oil, coal, flowstone, prove nothing about time. Only thing they prove is that under the proper conditions, these things can occur. That's all it proves. So the point is, don't be misled by the evolutionists that say these things take millions of years. And not only that, flood in the days of Noah would have contained all the conditions, all those proper conditions to do all these things. All the conditions would have been present during the flood. So what I want to do now is look at some evidence of a worldwide flood. First of all, I went too far. No, I'm sorry. This is the right one. My bad. There's canyons on Mars that all the scientists say that they were created in only a few weeks during a global flood. Some of these canyons are bigger than our Grand Canyon. Here's the thing, though. We don't know of any water on Mars. Yet, here on Earth, where water is plentiful, they can't believe the same thing about our Grand Canyon. It's kind of ironic, I would say. Secondly, there are over 250 flood stories and historical records throughout different cultures and parts of the world. For example, an archaeological discovery of tablets from Babylon are quite interesting. One of the tablets mentions the 10 kings of Babylon who lived before the flood. And then there's another one that names all the kings of Babylon, and after the first 10, they find the words, "The deluge came up." In these stories, there are many references to the salvation of only a few humans and the animals they brought along in the boat that they built to escape the flood. For example, there's Nuyu and his family from the Hawaiian culture. There's Fu Hai and his family from the Chinese culture. There's Cox Cox from the Toltec Indians of Mexico. And of course, we have Noah, both found in the Bible and the Quran. Then, go boy, there we go. In the account of Noah, the global flood occurred 4,400 years ago. I find it interesting. The oldest living organisms known on our planet, the bristlecone pine trees found here in the Southwest, they've been dated to be less than 5,000 years old. The Great Barrier Reef off the northeast coast of Australia, been estimated to be no more than 6,000 to 8,000 years old. So the question is, why are such living systems and organisms so young if the Earth is supposedly so old? There are erosion marks all across the west and southwest here in the U.S., places where it hardly ever rains. So how does that happen without them at one point being underwater and subjected to massive runoff? A worldwide flood would have resulted in rapid burial of plants and animals on a colossal scale. All the catastrophic events at the time, the worldwide release of waters from the deep, the earthquakes, the volcanoes, the unparalleled amount of force and devastation generated by all these abrupt geological changes, would have stopped life in its tracks. Therefore, if that was the case, evidence of rapid burial should be plentiful in the fossil records. And not surprisingly, that's exactly what we find. And let me first just mention that in order for an animal to become a fossil in the first place, it needs to be buried rapidly. Most animals, if they stick around unburied, they're either going to decompose or something else is going to eat them. So the fact that we have fossils at all in the first place gives strong evidence that they were buried rapidly. But let me show you some evidence here. How do we have so many fossils of fish? Fish are not likely candidates to become fossils. Dead fish, readily eaten by other animals. But there are millions and billions of fossilized fish that have been found together in sedimentary rock in huge quantities. Take a look at some of these. Not only are they in the huge numbers, there are fossils of fish still in the process of eating other fish. These, see those three? There's tons of these, but those three first ones, that fish died so quick it was still eating another fish, all of those. The bottom one down here, a little harder to see, but that one has eaten another fish, but has not had the time to decompose or to digest it. The other fish is still clearly visible inside the stomach of the one that had eaten it. These things can only be accounted for is if they were killed and buried rapidly. There's also a tremendous amount of fossils of invertebrates like clams, oysters, jellyfish, crustaceans. It's been estimated that 95% of all fossils are in this category. In order for something that's soft, like a jellyfish, to be fossilized, it has to be buried rapidly before all those soft parts can decompose. Like talking rapidly. Very quickly. We're talking minutes. Okay? Minutes. Yeah, not necessarily like that. I'm talking minutes. All right? Clams and oysters that are found are still in the closed position. You know when you pick up seashells, they're opened up because they died. To be in the closed position indicates they were still alive when they were buried. In order to bury fossils of so many ocean bottom dwellers, there would have had to have been a massive amount of sediment that came down through the water on top of them extremely rapidly. Also, if you talk about waters from the deep being released, those waters would have been under extreme temperatures being underneath, would have produced scalding water, which would have killed a lot of the animals from the temperature. So, not surprisingly, fish by the millions have been found buried in diatomaceous earth. What that is made up primarily of the shells of diatoms, which are microscopic sea creatures whose shells don't decompose when they die. So they end up becoming a constituent of the soil that they're a part of. Okay? Not only that, an 80-foot whale was found buried in diatomaceous earth in 1976 in a quarry in California. Plus, the whale was found standing on its tail at an angle of 45 degrees. So upside down on its tail at an angle of 45 degrees. Now the evolutionists try to put their spin on this and say the whale died, was buried, and then later seismic activity caused the earth to move. But let me explain something to you. This is again sleight of hand because it does not explain how the whale could have been buried in diatomaceous earth in the first place. Because they say diatomaceous earth collects at a rate of 1 inch every 10,000 years. How does an 80-foot whale get buried in that and not decompose in the amount of time it would have taken thousands of years for it to be buried? The only way that can be explained is if it was buried rapidly. How do you find fish by the millions buried in diatomaceous earth? Again, the only explanation is rapid burial of not only the fish, but rapid death and burial of the diatoms too. Look at these guys. These are fossils of ichthyosaurs, which are extinct marine reptiles. In the process of giving birth, the top one, you can see the beak coming out of the mother. Still in the process of giving birth, died and buried and fossilized in that position. The other one still has babies inside of her that haven't decomposed, that have also fossilized. The only way you can explain that is if they died and were buried rapidly. And one more thing we're going to go through here. If this is going on, you should also see rapid burial in land dwellers too. And one of the best places to see that is up in Siberia. Go ahead. Okay. In Siberia, in places like Alaska, the frozen remains of the mammoths have been found in such large numbers that they number in the tens of thousands to millions. On one island in Siberia, the remains are so plentiful that their bones constitute a major portion of the soil. So regardless of how many there are, it's clear, one thing's very clear, is that they're abundant. And it's interesting to note that these guys are always associated with the Ice Age. But they are rarely found in areas that were previously glaciated. The Colombian mammoth is even found in the southern U.S., Mexico, and Central America. And many of these mammoths, oh boy, are preserved so well, they still have their skin, hair, and internal organs. Their flesh is sometimes so well preserved that the researchers feed their dogs with it. That's how well preserved they are. They've also been found with food still in their stomachs, undigested, and still chewing their cud. So still with food in their mouth, undigested. And the food is from warm climates. Grasses, bluebells, buttercups, wild beans, and leaves. Of the several woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos that have been studied, they determined they died from suffocation with great exertion before dying. Many also died standing up, suffering numerous broken bones and even decapitation. Many are also buried inside the permafrost layer, that ground which never thaws. And these findings are significant and can only be explained by rapid death and burial. And let me explain. Their death by suffocation reflects either rapid burial while they were alive or drowning. Being so well preserved indicates that they were buried rapidly before any decomposition can take place. Being found in the permafrost zone indicates the permafrost zone was created the same time the mammoths were buried. You just try taking a dead, fresh mammoth and shoving it into frozen ground and see what happens. The only explanation is that those two things were formed at the same time. Being found dead and so well preserved while standing up indicates rapid death and burial. So, regardless of exactly how it happened, one thing is for sure: it happened fast. And if these findings aren't curious enough, Dr. Walt Brown examines extensively this situation in his book called In the Beginning. And he examines a lot of evidence that makes their existence in a cold climate very unlikely. For example, they have hair, not fur. They don't have erector muscles that animals use to puff up their fur, giving them insulating pockets when it's cold. They lack oil glands. The layer of fat that they have implies that food was abundant. The lack of food, drinking water, and salt in cold zones, and the heat loss they would have experienced through their trunk if they lived in a cold zone. All of these things are evidence that they didn't live in cold climates. The one last thing, you got that one? The one last thing, all the plants and animals found with them are from tropical zones, such as 90-foot tall fruit trees, herbs, mosses, shrubs, grasses, warble flies, fish, bulls, sheep, camels, rhinos, bison, horses, tigers, oxen, lions have all been buried with them in the Siberian ice. All of these things that they find are from temperate, moderate, or tropical zones. But they're all up there entombed in the ice. From evidence like this, you have to conclude that the animals and plants found in the Siberian ice were not native to cold areas like Siberia. So how'd they end up there? That's a great question. And there are numerous theories that have come up to try to explain this. The one thing that is certain, regardless of which theory you try to come up with, is that the environment in which they lived was very different from the environment in which they died. The environment they were in changed very rapidly as they died. And the only way to account for this is a cataclysmic global phenomenon. Only a catastrophic change of the earth could account for this. Very rapid geological changes, very rapid geological formation is the only way that you can account for this. But the mammoths and all those other guys buried with them aren't the only animals that have been found to be very well preserved. And so next week, We're going to look at some of those other animals like T-Rexes that have been found well preserved and the things that they found in them. So we're going to move on to that one. So we'll end here and then we'll move on to that one next week.